The word consciousness is used to describe what you are seeing, hearing, and feeling right now. Consciousness is an anomalous phenomenon, and it's not like the other phenomena of the natural world. Everything, except consciousness, is objective. Consciousness is subjective. Consciousness is something absolutely solitary, isolated. You can't look at consciousness from the outside. At the same time, we know that consciousness is a natural phenomenon that nevertheless does not obey fundamental physical laws. Despite the difficulties of studying this phenomenon, it is not difficult to define consciousness. The sense of mental images and sensations is consciousness. When you look at an object, you have an image of it in your mind. That image is human thought. With the help of laws of physics or even biology, it is impossible to explain thought and, as a consequence, consciousness. When I am hit by a car, I leave my imprint on two things, the car and my brain. If one survives in such a situation, one has acquired an inner content that is inaccessible to anyone else, an experience that will now float and periodically resurface as an autobiographical memory on the surface of the ocean of memory. To realize the form and property of the flora and fauna of our memory without simplification is not possible. Memories are often not even composed of words. What cannot be packed into words is inexpressible. Inexpressibility leads to the notion of simplicity and indecomposability. Some basic concepts cannot be explained with more basic concepts. For example, how do you explain what white or red means? It is an impossibility, because we do not see light as a wave of a certain length, but as a specific color. To our color senses, we have, of course, given names. The indivisibility of color and, as a consequence, of consciousness can be compared to the indivisibility of a quark. It turns out that the quark, as well as consciousness, is fundamental. The problems with understanding our consciousness are largely due to René Descartes, who separated body and soul on ethical grounds. The body is a vessel, and the soul is a rational being that is doomed to battle with the inner beast. The soul, according to Descartes, is not material, and thus cannot affect matter. But interaction does occur. Opera singers extract the right note, and the muscles of dancers contract exactly as the choreographer wants them to. Even a pencil outputting a poem, encoding a stream of thought on paper, moves under the laws of physics. The problem is that the monitor on which the stream of your consciousness, your life, is displayed does not stand in any particular office or bedroom. It can't even be found in any particular part of your brain. The workspace of your consciousness is not material, but it influences physical processes. This is where the fundamental contradiction that any philosopher or neuroscientist wants to resolve is buried. The best way is to destroy consciousness, to say it doesn't exist. It is easy to check whether a physical object actually exists. You can walk up and pick it up. This criterion of existence does not work for consciousness. It turns out that consciousness does not exist, but the feeling of itself does not disappear from this assumption. It turns out that there is no place for consciousness in the naturalistic picture of the world. But we can't abandon the notion. The pain of the blade is real, but from a philosophical, ontological point of view, we must declare consciousness a non-existent phenomenon. Besides, many researchers responsibly declare that consciousness is just an electrochemical process in the brain. So consciousness is the brain? No, because for one thing, it requires demonstrating a perfect substitution of mental terms for neurological terms. The neuroscientist doesn't care whether conscious states have a subjective private side. He is looking for the neurological expression of these processes. However, these neurological data are still sensed by someone. Thus, it is impossible to explain what we see, hear, and feel through neurobiological processes. It is as if we have something else besides matter. Why is brain functioning, which occurs for objective reasons, accompanied by a subjective and as if optional state? Why doesn't it occur in the dark? After all, our body doesn't really need us. Food is digested without our intervention. Hormones enter the bloodstream automatically. Our heart carries us into the future at 4,500 beats per hour. We can think our own thoughts and drive an automobile. Beyond that, we can even talk to someone, agree, and with a thought you will be in another corner of the planet, or even in the past. We've touched a wall right now, a boundary that one Australian philosopher called the hard problem of consciousness. But before I tell you how this man revolutionized, we need to understand the context. You probably didn't know that in 1994, when a book by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Era was published. It became a good thing to berate the great French philosopher who thought therefore existed for having slowed down the exploration of consciousness through neuroscience. The truth is that, in his time, René was not just wrong, but provoked an intellectual chaos that took scientists and philosophers more than 100 years to overcome. Educated at City College, René acquired the habit of spending his mornings in bed, engaged in meditation and reflection. According to Descartes, the thinking soul exists separately from the body and establishes communication with it through a special port, through the epiphysis. According to Descartes, when making conscious movements with the body, the soul, consciousness directs streams of special force to the nerves of the necessary limbs. This generates the movement of a person in space. In 1641, Meditations on First Philosophy was published. In this work, Descartes tried to formulate the distinction between the soul and the body. In it, the concept of dualism, eternal duality, was first formulated. Dualism is the idea that there are two beginnings, a spiritual beginning and a physical beginning. René considered both to be separate substances. The main property of physical or corporeal substance is spatial extent, and the irreducibility to matter of spiritual substance is thinking. The body, unlike the soul, exists in space and is a mechanism that can perform a number of functions without any participation of the soul. We have already understood this. Descartes considered animals to be robots because their behavior is fully explainable in terms of biological mechanisms. For him, they are beings of the same substance, creatures of circumscription. Descartes lived outside of time and so contemplated the creation of a machine that looked and acted like a human being. Since he had access only to 17th century technology, he believed that such a machine was impossible. A robot that looked identical to a human would still, in Descartes' opinion, be distinguished by two things. It would not be able to use language creatively, and it would not be able to communicate non-verbally. His eyes would give him away. It turns out he indirectly formulated the uncanny valley effect, even before Japanese roboticist Mori Masahiro. Of course, Cartesian dualism is one big contradiction. He himself wondered how the unextended soul interacts with the extended body. According to Descartes, it's beyond our comprehension. In February 1650, returning home in the early morning after a lesson with the Queen, Descartes caught a cold. The cold turned into pneumonia, and just a week later, Descartes died where he usually meditated. Descartes created the largest logical impasse in the history of philosophy, leaving science stuck in a Cartesian impasse for 300 years. The philosophical separation between the bulky material body and the weightless substance of mind was fatal. Philosophers, each in their own way, periodically threw themselves at the Descartesian concept and offered an alternative, while the natural sciences kept their distance. Only in the 19th century, with the advent of psychology and new knowledge of mental disorders, neurology and physiology began to consider the brain as a normal organ, and the psyche and thinking as its derivatives. Thinkers accepted this pitch, took their lenses away from the body-soul relationship, and focused on the brain-consciousness connection. At this point, it became obvious to everyone that the question of human consciousness required a new approach. One spring morning in 1994, in the United States, in the state of Arizona, in Tucson, a long-haired, unknown Australian man took the stage and gave a speech about consciousness. For the vast majority of scientists gathered at this conference, the issue of consciousness was taboo. David Chalmers' first presentation proved to be a complete failure. To be honest, they were completely incomprehensible and boring. I couldn't understand at all what he was talking about, recalls Stuart Hameroff, the professor responsible for the event. As the organizer, I was looking around every now and then and seeing people falling asleep out of boredom. I started to worry. But the third performance, right before the coffee break, changed everything. In a denim jacket and long hair, the 27-year-old philosopher Chalmers looked more like a fan of a hard rock band who had wandered into the wrong place. But as soon as he started talking about consciousness issues, everyone woke up. How do we store in our memory, cognize and perceive information? Why do we abruptly take our hands away from the fire or hear our name being spoken across the room at a loud party? These are all simple problems in their scope. It's just a matter of exploring our brains, a matter of experimentation. The approach to the solution is clear. But at this talk, Chalmers also articulated one truly difficult, as if even unsolvable question. A couple months after David's talk, this question threw the scientific and philosophical community into a confusion unprecedented since Descartes. This confusion was dubbed the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers managed to capture the audience's attention with a unique framing of the question. During the intermission, I paced around like a playwright at the premiere of a play, and everyone around me exclaimed, "The hard problem of consciousness. That's why we're here." Philosophers have pondered the relationship between mind and body for centuries, but it was Chalmers who managed to look beyond philosophy and even science. More than 20 years later, we know a great deal about the brain. If you follow the news, you can read a big article every week about discoveries in brain knowledge, and this is only what has been popularly articulated. The field of research and development of artificial intelligence capabilities, which essentially focuses on recreating the brain, has also made tremendous progress. But Chalmers' hard problem has not been solved. To understand the reason for the popularity of his hard problem, we will need to deal with what actually happened at that conference. The main thing Chalmers did was divorce the easy and hard problems of consciousness. The Tucson speech ensured this man's worldwide fame. At the beginning of the 21st century, it is impossible to find a single book on consciousness that does not quote David Chalmers. What did he formulate? And why is everyone still talking about him? The secret is simplicity. According to Chalmers, there are two types of problems that confront any consciousness researcher. Simple problems lend themselves to empirical investigation. They are a logical consequence of the facts about how the brain works, just as understanding the design of an engine helps us understand why the iron is needed. What is of interest, however, is the hard problem that is creeping into the culture. The hard problem is the reason why processes in the brain, physical processes, are accompanied by subjective experience, or, as it is called in English-speaking philosophy, qualia. Subjective experience should be understood not just as image and sound. Someone lives without these flows of information. Subjective experience is a flow of sensation. It is the quintessence of thought, images, associations, and emotions. In other words, the hard problem is the problem of explaining why the operation of a certain biochemical mechanism, our brain, is accompanied by consciousness and us. As we have already realized, the body could do it without us. Why doesn't everything in the brain work for us in the dark? To solve the hard problem of consciousness is to figure out how matter transitions out of matter, because the houses, trees, or bridges that appear in your consciousness weigh nothing. They are all nothing more than a particular brain's interpretation of incoming signals. The objects you see are not in space. Any picture is part of your personalized experience. It's part of qualia. But why does this physical world, the universe, need this projection? Why does the physical world need the self? Why did physical processes give rise to something so non-compulsory as human subjectivity? Why human? Because animals have a liveliness, imitated by internal reflexes. But they look at us in a way that mountains or even trees don't. Could it be that animals also have consciousness and subjectivity as one? The boundaries of consciousness are difficult to delineate. The definition of the simplest things eludes us, like a streamlined river fish. Is it conscious of itself and what is happening to it? Does the fish have consciousness? In 1997, psychologist Gordon Gallup came up with the idea to test the level of self-awareness in animals by making marks on a subject's face and placing a mirror in front of it. Only a creature with high self-awareness would be able to detect the mark. People aged 1.5 years, as well as chimpanzees, gorillas, elephants, and magpies coped with this test. After this experiment, disputes about consciousness in animals did not subside for 42 years. And on July 7, 2012, 25 leading neurobiologists, neurophysiologists, psychiatrists from around the world gathered in Cambridge. Then, among the guests was President and Stephen Hawking. The meeting dragged on, and only at night the scientists made a unanimous decision. We declare the following. The absence of the neocortex is not a barrier to the body's experience of sentient states. Consequently, the weight of evidence shows that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological mechanisms that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological mechanisms. Ignoring the significance of this development will not do. 25 leading scientists have officially signed on to the claim that humans are not the only ones with consciousness. Consciousness gives life meaning. If we were not conscious, nothing in life would have meaning or value. The Cambridge Declaration must sooner or later be the cause of a major ethical chain. Why does life acquire consciousness? What do we need this first person for? Why are we not created simply as robots processing incoming data? Why are we given the ability to feel? Solving the problem of consciousness has been attempted by all these beautiful portraits, but perhaps only our Australian has come close to the answer. Science is inherently objective. This is clear to us. After all, the bet on objective understanding worked, and we created all the technical magic we're using right now. Newton's laws once laid the foundation for mechanics, which allowed humans to expand the urban landscape. In the 19th century, engineers applied Newton's laws to explain the nature of heat, and it became clear that heat was simply the movement of molecules. Engineers were able to capitalize on this knowledge. Water began to turn into steam, which then gave metal motion. The steam engine beat the horse. Steel rails enveloped the globe, increasing the circulation of goods, people, and information. Consciousness is subjective, so you can't dissect it with an empirical scalpel. So there can be no science of consciousness. For most of the 20th century, this viewpoint prevailed. Chalmers believes that science has fundamental limitations, so he fearlessly throws himself at the problem. As we have already discovered, science is objective, but consciousness is not. In the 20th century, psychologists objectively studied behavior. Neurobiologists objectively studied the brain, but no one has ever seriously tackled consciousness. You'd think we'd give science a couple more years, and then we'd read in the popular science media about how neurobiologists from some distinguished university have solved the problem of consciousness by discovering new neural interactions. For example, we know how living organisms reproduce, how they adapt and carry out the process of metabolism. After all, these are all processes of objective functioning. Based on brain configuration, we can explain how we walk, how we talk, how we play soccer. But these are all matters of behavior, not consciousness. Chalmers' challenging question is why behavior is accompanied by subjective experience. Why are we not in a quiet, intangible, neutral nothingness, or simply in darkness, without the ability to think about anything, to remember, to think? How does matter give rise to consciousness? Here, the neurobiological paradigm is powerless. We are used to physics explaining chemistry. Chemistry explains biology. Biology partially explains psychology. But consciousness doesn't seem to fit into this scientific picture. Consciousness is a given, an anomaly. That is, an exception to the rule. When faced with an anomaly, only an audacious idea like Newton's can be a lifeline. Well, our Chalmers has come up with a few ideas. The first one goes like this. What if consciousness is fundamental? Physicists often take certain aspects of the universe to be fundamental, such as space, time, or mass. In the same way, molecules are made up of atoms. Atoms are made up of hadrons. Hadrons are made up of quarks. Quarks can't be broken down into something smaller because they're constrained by the law of confinement. This is what the proven principles of the universe look like. Fundamental concepts help derive fundamental laws, like the law of universal gravitation or quantum mechanics. The fundamental laws of the universe cannot be explained. It is impossible to understand fundamental things through more fundamental things. Everything indivisible we call elementary. From an understanding of the elementary, a scientific model of the world is formed. Sometimes the list of fundamentals is longer. For example, in the 19th century, Maxwell proved that it is impossible to explain electromagnetic phenomena on the basis of the existing fundamentals of physics, space, time, mass, and Newton's laws. Therefore, he derived the basic laws of electromagnetism. As a result, electric charge was accepted as a fundamental principle. The conclusion is that the scientific model can be updated. Intangible consciousness cannot be explained based on existing principles. space, time, mass, and charge. Then, the phenomenon of consciousness must be placed next to other basic and fundamental principles of our universe. Then, it is necessary to deduce the laws governing consciousness and the laws connecting consciousness to the space-time continuum. That was the first idea, the idea of fundamentality. But there's a second idea. What if consciousness is universal, and we can assume that any system has consciousness to some degree? This view is called panpsychism. Based on this hypothesis, all systems possess their own degree of consciousness. Panpsychism consists in the idea that consciousness is the most important feature of physical matter, and each individual particle has its own proto-consciousness. Combining particles under fortunate circumstances, such as what happened with life, leads to a more complex and expanded potential for consciousness. Perhaps the simplest and most effective way to define the fundamental laws of consciousness is to relate it to the concept of information. The neuroscientist Giulio Tononi managed to fit consciousness into the natural scientific picture of the world. His integrated information theory has become one of the most influential theories of consciousness in the 21st century. According to this theory, consciousness can be measured by determining the amount of connected information, or simply integration. Generalization of information signal is not only characteristic of the human brain. Transistors are similar to neurons in that they generalize incoming information and make logical operations. Thus, this theory allows us to describe not only human consciousness, but also what gives rise to artificial intelligence. Integrated information theory is the idea that different consciousnesses process and connect the information coming into them in different ways. Giulio created a unit for measuring the generalization and processing of information and called it phi. The phi indicator is correlated with consciousness. For example, in the human brain, the amount of information generalization is incredibly high. Only a complex consciousness can have a high phi score. A cat has a medium degree of information integration. If we look at simpler life forms, we see the volume of phys shrinking and shrinking, but it is never zero. The proton can possess phi because the proton arises from the relationship of quarks. In integrated information theory, this is a scientific justification of the ancient idea of panpsychism, an idea that, despite its age, turns out to be very correct. The development of this theory may help to fit consciousness into the world of physical laws. Physicists and philosophers often point out that physics is strangely abstract. It describes the structure of reality using an equation, but it does not tell us about the reality that underlies it. Physicists develop a physical model. As Giulio Tononi states, wherever there is information processing, there is consciousness. Complex information processing, as in humans. Complex consciousness. Simple information processing. Simple consciousness. This panpsychic view, according to Chalmers, has the potential to transform our relationship to the universe. In integrated information theory, there is a difficult-to-understand point called exclusion. According to it, parts of the brain, neurons, ganglia, amygdala, visual cortex, can have non-zero phi, which means that certain areas of the brain have their own mini-intelligence. But because the phi of the whole brain is superior to all the other phi of the mini-minds, we are alone in the body most of the time. Perhaps the brain is still afraid of the rebellion of these parts. That's why we are so scared of parasites. This point helps the thought take flight in an interesting way. If a group of people start communicating with each other with extreme but achievable mindfulness, Group Phi will surpass the phi of individuals. Group consciousness has a tremendous advantage when solving a problem. Here, we can think of the famous Brain Trust production program of Pixar Studios. The author brings his developments. There is a discussion in which other creative directors express their opinions. The quality of Pixar cartoons has been consistent until recently, because cool advice is hard to ignore. Tononi's theory tells us, the group forms a decentralized consciousness that transcends consciousness concentrated in one person. In this marvelous section, a sect or a crowd would be a diseased organism. After all, any sect has rigid rules that exclude the possibility of flexible collective reflection. If we believe in the absolute universality of panpsychism, we can ask the question, does a crowd, a business, or an entire state have consciousness? Here we can think of the organic theory. which consists in the idea that people will always naturally, like Power Rangers, gather into something incomparably larger, into a huge being with its own anatomy and physiology, something going through the stages of formation and aging. If you look at the modern Earth from space, it becomes noticeable that the planet is captured by several huge leviathans, competing with other giants for the right of their own existence. To summarize, in 1994, in Arizona, David Chalmers formulated the simplicity and difficulty of consciousness problems. Simple problems, according to Chalmers, are amenable to research. We already know quite a bit about the brain, but we still know nothing about consciousness. Why does this intangible screen turn on? In addition, we have come to the rather radical conclusion that the level of consciousness is actually measurable, and the phi number becomes for us an objective unit of measurement comparable to degrees Celsius and meters. Have these audacious ideas allowed us to solve the main problem of consciousness? It turns out that David Chalmers' ideas helped us to sew the phenomenon of consciousness to the blanket of objective knowledge with the needle of thought. So, the answer is found. But then why this man declared at the New York seminar that he was an official skeptic of integrated information theory, and then thanked that his lunch was not poisoned? Is it really more complicated than that? Meet Scott Aaronson. He is an American scientist and information theorist who openly opposes the proponents of integrated information theory. Aaronson's main claim is related to the claim that phi proves the existence of consciousness. Phi may be a necessary condition for consciousness, but certainly not sufficient. Since the phi number is a non-exhaustive indicator, the plausibility of integrated information theory collapses before our eyes. In addition, Aaronson believes that he has no problem developing many simple systems with high phi. For example, a two-dimensional grid that allows error-correcting codes like those used in CD-ROMs. By Giulio Tononi's logic, disks have an extremely high phi number, and thus a complex integrated consciousness. Integrated information theory inevitably predicts a huge number of consciousnesses in physical systems that no sane person considers particularly conscious. More, this theory predicts not only that systems are conscious, but that they should be more conscious than humans. In other words, according to Aaronson, integrated information theory is unscientific. In addition, ironically thanked the theory's proponents for creating a specific enough testable theory that he could easily refute it. The other theories are so vague and unspecific that they can only claim to be wrong. Giulio Tononi ignored Aaronson's criticism. We were prepared for extreme surprise. So did the programmer split the positions of Tononi and Chalmers and hold up or not. And in fact, Aaronson has hit the heavy jackhammer of the problem of other consciousnesses with his reasoning. Problems of other consciousnesses in this context means failure to envision a consciousness alternative to human consciousness. Humans feel their own consciousness and see others. The logic is simple. People are like me, so they have consciousness too. But I can't imagine that CDs have it. Many of Tononi's devoted supporters began to question his understanding and suggested that we should get busy building a consciousness meter that could determine phi, and therefore the consciousness of any system, from an iPhone to a human or a snake. The measurements would help fit the physical world into consciousness. But once they got started, it became clear to them that such an instrument would actually say no more than a tomograph. After all, brain scanners only help solve simple problems of consciousness. Consciousness, as a complex sense of that familiar space for thought, cannot be measured. We missed him again, and the answer has dissolved into a crowd of contradictions. Are we back where we started, with simple questions about the structure of the brain? All indications are that we're at an impasse. By walking this part of the journey with me, you've become a Mysterian. That is, someone who recognized the intractability of the difficult problem of consciousness. But are the simple problems of consciousness so uninteresting? Why have we ignored what we've been given all this time? And what we are given is our body, our brain, and the direct invasive ether of our life. We are given our personality. We are given an eye that understands speech at this very second. Chalmers' troublesome, difficult problem can be reduced to the question of why do we not live in the dark? Why do we feel it all this diversity? Why are neurophysiological physical processes accompanied by consciousness that can't be explained like other phenomena of nature can be explained? What if I told you that this question is fundamentally incorrect? And the brilliant Australian philosopher was wrong. What if David Chalmers and other philosophers who deal with the question of consciousness are engaged in beautiful, intellectual, but fruitless equilibrium? And there really is no hard problem of consciousness. We've been intentionally avoiding getting the question right all this time in order to better understand the neurophilosophical context. Because understanding the context helps you ask the right questions and eventually meet the answer in the crowd of thoughts. The right question is, why did we turn on the lights? To move forward with an investigation, we need to rethink our approach. That's the only way we'll increase our chances. It's not going to be easy. And to do that, we need to rethink our relationship to the universe by answering another tricky question. What is information? In the everyday sense, we use the word information to refer to meaningful and usually transmitted knowledge. Information is transmitted when two people talk. When reading, information is converted from writing to thoughts. Information is copied when files are sent from one computer to another. These examples might lead one to think that information arises at the moment of dissemination. That is, from a domestic point of view, information is a measure of communication, a word denoting the transfer of some important parameters and characteristics from one system to another. From the physical point of view, information may not be sent anywhere. Information is not a measure of sent parameters. It is the parameters themselves. For example, a house contains information about the mutual arrangement of bricks, and this information exists independently from the bricks themselves, from your knowledge about these bricks, and from the material world in general. It may not be written down anywhere and unknown to anyone, but information is what distinguishes a house from individual bricks. Information is not a measure of communication. It is a measure of order, an index of the properties of a system that distinguishes it from chaos. Information organizes matter and gives it form. Information is independent of its carrier. Any book is a carrier of text. Letters written in a certain sequence. Text is a hierarchy of meanings, harmonized and formulated thoughts. When people burn books, they burn paper and ink, but not texts. A text lives as long as something contains it. From this point of view, we need to take another look at the universe. Suppose everything in the universe has been destroyed, reduced to homogeneous vapor. The total amount of matter would remain exactly the same. Even the number of atoms and particles would be the same. Only information, a special, unique distribution of this matter, will disappear. Information is the recipe for the universe that you and I know. The story of the origin of consciousness begins with a small bacterial cell called an archibacterium, which decided to take the first step in approaching another cell. Bacteria have always lived in large, close-knit families, but at some point in the past, a bacterium, driven by strange feelings, went to bond with another bacterium. As a consequence, the bacterium became dependent. The uncertainty of the relationship was eating the cell from the inside out. But at one point, the other bacterium reciprocated, and a merger took place. Something bigger emerged. Endosymbiosis happened. By sharing responsibilities, these cells became one. Others followed suit. And so, a new type of life form emerged, the nuclear eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotes evolved about 1.5 billion years ago. They split off from single-celled prokaryotes and took over the world, becoming more and more complex. And now you're looking at yourself in the mirror. With the emergence of eukaryotes came a revolution. Bacteria and creatures plural, operating not as individual organisms, but as whole populations, strains. Eukaryotes, for the first time, begin to operate not only as strains, but also as individuals. For the unicellular, only the set of genes within a cell matter. With the emergence of endosymbiosis, in which cells together form something larger, it is not just genetic information that becomes important, but the personal history of the organism. The evolutionary bet of eukaryotes became to achieve perfection, not within an entire population, but just one organism. It is at this point in nature that individualism begins to develop. We are eukaryotes. From the very beginning, we've relied on complexity, and we're still reaping the rewards of that decision in science and philosophy. Eukaryotes burned more and more energy as they grew larger, more complex, and more advanced. The bigger they got, the more they were required to sustain life in their huge bodies. Once they breathed in oxygen without dying, they jumped on an evolutionary train they could never get off of. If a person stops breathing for a few minutes, the neurons of their brain become severely short of energy stores. This brain is the energetic culmination of life on Earth, Our huge, warm-blooded body stokes the nutrient-breathing furnace at the limits of biochemical capacity, but the brain consumes 10 times as much energy per body weight. Almost all of that energy goes into maintaining the charge on the membranes of hundreds of billions of neurons. If energy supplies are reduced, the charge on the membranes begins to drop in literally minutes, eventually causing uncontrolled neurotransmitter release, seizures, and death. No human being is more addicted than to this gas. From premature withdrawal, a person is protected by an illusory instinct of self-preservation. In some, it is weakened. But one thing is clear. Since we have lived to this point, it means that our ancestors did not leave the round early. Something is keeping us from shutting down of our own volition. Now we need to pay attention. Almost our entire body is made of cells whose genes are doomed to die. Muscle cells, or brain cells, contain DNA, just as eggs and sperm cells do. But skin or brain DNA will never leave our body, and thus will never produce offspring. That is, most of the cells in our body are being held hostage from an evolutionary standpoint. We are two castes of cells, and these two castes of cells have a name: brain cells, muscle cells, skin cells, liver cells, and basically, the cells that make up our body are called somatic cells, which means from the Greek soma, body. Soma are the dead-end cells that are subordinate to the elite, minority, proliferating cells that live in the reproductive organs. The same as the ruling dynasty are responsible to history, that is, evolution. These breeding monarchs produce auxiliary ships for their purposes, that is you and me, to sail through time. The flow of genetic information is called a germoplasm. The purpose of the germoplasm is immortality. From a unicellular perspective, multicellularity is a form of social relations in which the minority subjugates the majority, doomed to die. The most interesting and frightening thing here is that we look at the world precisely from the perspective of these very same doomed-to-death cells, whoever we are in human society. Our body, our brain, our consciousness, all of what we call me, is a dead-end branch of evolution, produced by the movement of our germoplasm. So man is a slave to the germoplasm and his genes. In fact, we only became free because of this cellular division. If we were united with our germoplasm, we could not in principle go against our genes, just as bacteria cannot go against their genes, but ourselves. Soma has nothing in principle to prevent it from disobeying the germoplasm. Of course, it's not inherent to her to do so, because organisms that don't ensure the survival of the germoplasm quickly die out. A multicellular organism is a highly complex construct, the number of parts in which greatly exceeds the number of genes in the genome. Nevertheless, all the instructions for these parts must fit in a single cell sent to the next generation, and this is impossible. Therefore, the more complex an organism is, the more personal freedom it has. Soma cells get the rest of the information they need to survive from the environment. In animals, the culmination of this antigenic free will is the invention of a special department that learns during its life what is not contained in the genes. This machine is called the brain. Thanks to multicellularity, we are able to think for ourselves. But one aspect of our relationship with our bodies remains unchanged. Germplasm has access to immortality, while we do not. Life is a layering of levels, each composed of components of the previous one, but not reducible to those components. A multicellular organism is not just many cells. A cell is more than a bunch of chromosomes and proteins. A molecule is not just a collection of atoms. In each of these cases, the whole is greater than the sum of the components. Panpsychists, speaking about the potential for consciousness in photons of light, do not really mean the phenomenon of consciousness, but something else. A phenomenon that turns the understanding of matter, space, and even information upside down. That phenomenon is emergentism. Emergentism is a very simple idea. Something in isolation will not have the potential of the whole. One soccer player is not a team. A frame is not a scene, and a scene is not a movie. A board member is not a company. A state is not one citizen. A molecule is not just a few atoms. It is also a particular configuration. The interrelationship of elements gives rise to new meaning and properties. Music is a time-spanning relationship of notes. A system has properties that its components do not have. This is important to understand. This is emergentism. But in the case of ever-moving living nature, emergentism is a long-term survival strategy, a way of forever creating new things, wherever the possibilities are exhausted. The main strategy of our very distant ancestors, the Mesozoic mammals or synapsids under the oppression of their main competitors, the dinosaurs, is thought to have been to master the nocturnal lifestyle. Our ancestors spent the Mesozoic era in the dark. Small creatures, content with the dark time of day, developed night vision and alternative senses to cope with the first and foremost problem of the night: darkness. The evolutionary investment in new ways of knowing the world culminated in the emergence of the cerebral cortex. The main function of the mammalian brain is to link the senses, extracting abstract meaning from their signals. It is the cortex that determines our thinking and consciousness. 10 million years after the meteorite impact that wiped out the dinosaurs, primates appear in the geologic record. The extinction of the dinosaurs helped mammals fill ecological niches. The ability in the forest to move in 3 dimensions for primates is akin to flight, limited by the height of the trees. In order to fly, one must see. This is why most primates have abandoned the nocturnal lifestyle. Nightlife helped mammals gain an advantage: big brains. Because when information is scarce, and it's scarce at night, you have to go in a different direction and improve your analytical abilities. In the first month of fetal development, our brains resemble fish brains in every way. But by the end of the second month, in humans, the swellings at the end of the tube get bigger. They continue to grow, and at some point, literally no longer fitting into the skull, they begin to shrink into themselves. They form gyrus. The folding of our brain illustrates the fact that it's not just its mass that matters. It's something else. It's the area that matters. All the most important things we know about the cortex are known through the insertion of electrodes into different parts of the cortex. When scientists first began to observe cortical neurons in this way, they instantly discovered that the cortex is functionally a plane. Wilder Penfield's famous research on epileptics is one of the main sources of our understanding of our own brains. Penfield's scientific merit was a byproduct of surgery on epileptic patients with open skulls. Penfield's method is to bare a person with epilepsy's brain, find the focus of the lesion causing the seizures, and cut it out. It's very simple. As barbaric as it may sound, such an operation works surprisingly well. The problem is finding the lesion. Penfield randomly stimulated different areas of the cortex with an electrical signal and asked patients to describe how they felt, until one of the pulses caused a seizure. It turns out that stimulation of different parts of the brain can cause anything. Some points cause tactile sensations in different parts of the body. Others make those parts of the body twitch. Still others trigger dreams, smells, images, memories, and déjà vu. Some areas respond to the simplest elementary signals from the senses. There are points in the cortex that respond to patches of color and different frequencies, but at the same time there are areas that are attuned not just to individual pixels or frequencies, but to more abstract properties of the world around us. The correspondences of the sense of reality, memory, thought, and areas on the surface of the brain are called representation. Your brain is, by and large, a city composed solely of embassies of some phenomena of the external, but more importantly, internal world. If you think about something or receive some information, deep inside you in some embassy lights up and work begins. The working day of ambassadors is irregular, so if you don't want them to die, you have to sleep. Everything you experience has a physical address in the metropolis of the brain. The entire tactile part of the cortex can be thought of as a map of the body. If cortical areas are activated when you touch the tip of your tongue, you'll find a representation of the middle of your tongue nearby, followed by a representation of your lip, chin, and so on. In the auditory cortex, everything is exactly the same, one after another. There are representations of different frequencies, smoothly flowing into each other. If you move from the occipital to the frontal areas, the representations become less and less specific. They smoothly flow into each other, but no longer along the axis of sound frequencies or body parts, but along the axis of abstraction. For example, the visual cortex is located in the back of the head. The neurons of its columns respond to the most elementary, the most concrete visual stimuli. To light, as we move from the occiput toward the forehead, the columns begin to respond to more and more abstract properties of the visual object. Neurons, responding to points and lines, are replaced by neurons responding to angles. They are replaced by neurons that respond to shapes, and finally to categories of objects: a face, a tree, or a fire escape. From simple stimuli, abstractions, that is, generalizations, are assembled. Our brain is automatically a machine that assembles complex ideas from simple information, raw materials. According to the theory of predictive coding, the task of the cortex is to hunt down and exterminate questions, even more correctly, inconsistencies within itself by any means. If the cortex receives signals from the eyes or ears that do not fit into the developed system of understanding, they are destroyed. The cortex does not like it when questions make a show in the streets of consciousness. It immediately tries to disperse them with fighters of trivial, violent, conservative thought. The police of our consciousness will always try to maintain a regime of complete explanation in the city. This is why the present opening is worth a great deal to us. Dealing with the power structures of our inner metropolis for even a second is very difficult. But what if we overthrow the cortical dictator and destroy these power structures and begin to perceive and memorize everything we can, everything that comes into the brain? The outcome of this neurochemical revolution would be epileptic collapse. Trying to process everything the universe has to offer, neurons may not be able to keep up. In part, to prevent such an outcome, we have evolved an attention mechanism. We like to think we are driven by rational motives, striving for objectivity, for truth. What our brain really wants is not rationality. It wants coherence. It doesn't matter whether it's objective or subjective. What matters is what doesn't interfere with what we believe. We react violently to deviation from what we're used to. Unlocking the door of our apartment, we almost never pay attention. But if we discover that the door is unlocked, our attention is sharply aroused. Tourists in the city look around and absorb new things. City dwellers simply wander down the alleys of their own memories. If all the bark wants is explanation, why doesn't it make us abandon the world and stay in a dark room? See nothing and hear nothing, receive no new information. Why do we prefer the motley, noisy and chaotic world to the quiet, calm darkness? Why does one become a tourist if one's bark wants certainty? Why do you and I live under the sun? Does the city of our brain police sifting out unnecessary information need someone to reckon with? The clue is that the bark is not content with incoming information. In addition to it, other parts of the brain from memory, emotion, and the pleasure system are constantly calling City Hall. These calls are what push the cortex out of the darkroom, retrieving memories of past pleasures of bread, fruit, socializing, and the unexpected. The reward system keeps the police in check, keeps them from destroying the sprouts of lively curiosity, encourages us to do seemingly reckless things. Nice follies are nice to remember. The Ministry of Memory helps us not to forget. The things that make us happy help us learn. But the bitterness of our existence is that we seek both tranquility and adventure at the same time. Happiness settled long ago and built a cabin between the hills of immutability and the forest of revelation. But what is happiness? Why are we striving somewhere? We've compared bacteria to eukaryotes before, and we concluded that for bacteria, there is no difference between doing something for themselves or for the species, whereas for eukaryotes, there is a difference because of the high cost of a multicellular organism. Hermoplasma continues uninterrupted from generation to generation, and therefore, it is responsible for the entire evolutionary process. Soma, on the other hand, is born and dies only once, and is therefore subject to the genetic will of the germoplasma in everything. However, as the multicellular organism grows larger and more complex, soma begins to partially escape the influence of the genes and the germline. Since the entire body is the product of the same zygote, all of its instructions must fit in one cell, in one genome. Up to certain limits, this is possible. All our cells contain genes. These genes contain the mechanisms by which some cells turn into arms, others into legs, and others into heads. However, it is simply impossible to foresee everything that can happen to a conglomerate of trillions of cells over the years of life. Genetically, the oldest repository turns out to be quite inadequate. That's why the germoplasm in the Precambrian gave soma the ability to learn, the rudiments of a system whose original task was to conduct signals between body parts. This is the nervous system, penetrating their body with long cells conductors and supplying them with electrical activity. The animals received their own system of rapid response. That's how neurons and synapses came to be. By adjusting the strength of the synapses, the organism could direct its behavior in one direction or the other. By giving the animal the ability to learn, genes eliminated the need to spend millions of years honing every reflex and anticipating every possible situation, losing millions of organisms in the process. Instead, the animal gained the ability to manage itself, constantly analyzing the situation and taking into account any changes in the world around it. From the point of view of the germoplasmic dictatorship, brain autonomy is acceptable, if only to point it in what direction to move. What started as a network of signal transmission from the senses to the muscles gradually evolved into an autonomous understanding machine, driven by genetic motivations. Much of the brain has evolved into a system of synapses, that is, a system for generalizing information. This process is still under genetic control. Any understanding machine is part of soma, which means it dies every generation, so it has no influence for eternity, whereas the germoplasma continues to evolve and control any excesses of the brain. Genes are always trying to keep us in check, but the development of the brain's understanding abilities has consistently proven to be genetically advantageous, especially in difficult situations, such as the Mesozoic nights, when mammalian ancestors were forced to hide from dinosaurs. Therefore, the logical development of brain autonomy was the emergence of the cerebral cortex, a universal machine for understanding everything. This machine so effectively and deeply analyzed the dark and cold reality that genes could not keep up with it. Gradually, the bark learned to choose what to strive for and enjoy by setting general goals and limits: no death, good nutrition, reproduction, no satisfaction. The genes gave the individual the right to decide what that meant. By giving the cortex partial control over the reward system, the genes let go of the reins that held the brain together. Given free rein, the brain began to fill with thought and behavior every space of opportunity it could find. I congratulate you. We've reached an important section. Now there are two different forces in the organism: the gene, which requires moving forward through time, and the personality, which requires its own development. But the important thing is happiness. Over the last few million years, all the major trends in human evolution are clear. We stand out from the primates with many characteristics: large brains, upright posture. But none of these characteristics make us unique. All of them, to a greater or lesser extent, can be traced back to other primates. The differences between man and ape are no longer visible on closer inspection. All life is made up of the same construct. But we're not them. We just need to look for differences, not in brain size, body temperature, or hormones, but in something emergent, some property common to every human being. There is only one such quality. We acquired it about 70,000 years ago. It distinguishes us not just from primates, but from all living things that have ever inhabited this planet, and perhaps the universe. Civilization, culture, science, history, art, and indeed the human personality in general are based on this characteristic of ours. This new way of existence fundamentally changes the rules of the game called life. This property is called language. You and I have been able to reach this point of mutual understanding only thanks to language. What is consciousness? A question made up of words. It's difficult to answer. There are many problems with this elusive phenomenon. Some thinking people are convinced that there is no answer to this question. Some think it will appear in a dimension of the future. Some seek it in the abstractions of the past, immersing themselves in ancient religious texts. On the other hand, it's simple, and you probably felt that the answer has already been found. Consciousness is the beautiful word emergent. Consciousness is a subjective for each organism outcome of evolutionary development. It is a game with clear rules, intuitive first-person control. There really are a lot of consciousnesses, and the Earth has long been overgrown with conscious life. It's just that for one of the species it became obvious only recently. We are well aware that any consciousness, even the consciousness of a butterfly, much less a crow or octopus, is so complex that human cognitive abilities stand out in quantitative categories, but not in qualitative ones. The landscape of our planet has changed because evolution has refined a mental tool called language. Everything is erected because of it. Language is our main invention, our wings. But are they ours alone? I'll prove to you that it's not. Other living things also use a variety of languages to communicate information. Trees exchange chemical signals about the attacks of a parasitic fungus. Crayfish recognize each other by pheromones. Birds sing songs to each other. And a substantial percentage of the world's population emits light for self-defense or to attract a mate. Consciousnesses on this planet have long interacted on a chemical, sonic, and even pictorial level. Most such signals differ from human language in that they convey an extremely limited range of ideas. This is true, although there are examples of communication at a more advanced level among animals. Dolphins come up with unique whistle names for themselves. They usually do this by copying someone else's whistle with a slight modification. Other dolphins memorize the name of a young kin and begin to use it in communication. Like birds, whales are not born with the ability to sing, but learn specific songs from those around them. In birds, fathers usually teach their sons, whereas whales imitate everyone around them and internalize the specifics of local songs. As a result, song dialects can form within the same species that change and evolve with each generation. This is in the full sense of the word culture. The uniqueness of the individual persistently floats away from us. Dolphins and vervetfish have words with different meanings. Birds can also learn complex combinations of signals, and whales even have cultural tendencies. And the example of bonobo kanzi shows that, if primates at the right moment to place it in a language environment available to him, he is able to learn human language. Yet imitation does not occur in nature. Monkeys in the jungle do not teach other monkeys complex sequences of conventional signs. This happens only among humans. Only man, having left the forest, began to live for the abstract, unconcrete, and, as if far-fetched, man builds a highway in front of him, and having invented the word horizon, tries to reach it. Is this apostasy? Actually, no. It is a stage in the development of life, a phenomenon that came into existence, perhaps as mysteriously as the universe. Consciousness is a fundamental translation that is triggered in biological media. But what then is the self? It is Charles Robert Darwin who has thrown us a lifeline. Evolution occurs as a result of a combination of variability, heredity, and selection. If we are talking about variability, heredity, and gene selection, then biological species evolve. But by themselves, these three concepts need not necessarily apply to DNA at all. The strength of Darwinian theory is that it works in any system where there are inherited but variable traits subject to selection. In a cultural sense, selection works on ideas, words, concepts that create the conditions for their own reproduction in the face of imminent oblivion. Ideas have always adjusted to the demands of the human brain. This has shaped society over time. Genetic evolution creates all the necessary conditions for cultural evolution. We all speak languages we did not invent. Each person receives an ideological inheritance, cultural capital. One person infects another with meanings. Any idea, like a gene, thus acquiring the property of reproduction, falls under the jurisdiction of Darwin's theory, and thus, to some extent, becomes alive. The uniqueness of man is that he is the product of not one, but two evolutions, ancient genetic and new cultural. The evolution of genes gave man a brain, but it was the evolution of meanings that filled that consciousness with words. In 1930, Benjamin Lee Whorf, a fire protection systems engineer and keen amateur linguist, together with anthropologist Edward Sapir, put forward the so-called principle of linguistic relativity, in which he saw a direct parallel to Einstein's theory of relativity. According to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, language is not just a means of expressing inner feelings. It is a way of interpreting reality, an agreement on a system of categories accepted in a given society. Just as in Einstein's theory of relativity, time and space appear fluid, dependent on the position and speed of the observer. So for Sapir and Whorf, the meaning of the world around us becomes dependent on the words used to describe it. Whorf arrived at his principle by studying the languages of the peoples of Central America and concluding that speakers of different languages think differently about the same things. We dissect nature along the lines drawn by our own language. The categories and types we isolate from the world of phenomena we discover not because they are conspicuous to any observer. Rather, the world appears as a kaleidoscopic impression that must be organized by our minds. That is, for the most part, by the linguistic system of our minds. We slice up nature, organize it into concepts, and assign certain meanings. primarily because we are participants in an arrangement operating within our speech community and encoded it in the patterns of our language. Language is an operating system. It is installed in the brain and allows it to be better controlled. But if it is not installed in time, we lose the person. We think in words. And the words we've been taught determine how we think. Man, like all mammals, spends his childhood learning the patterns of the environment and depositing them in the storehouse of his own memory. As a result, a multi-level model of reality is formed in the human mind, in which each aspect of reality consists of a combination of other aspects and is itself a part of other combinations. Expressed mathematically, our thinking space, our consciousness, is a fractal. The events we perceive turn into Lego pieces in our memory, which we use in our moments of speaking, writing, thinking. With thought, we mix everything with everything. That's how we create something new. What fractals one has been taught depends on the strength and direction of one's construction. Language is a symbiotic virus that develops in us the ability to split the world into multi-level patterns. The result of this infection has been the explosive development of intellectual capacity in a single group of primates, and at the same time, the total penetration of the language virus into humanity. The word life can be looked at from 2 points of view. The first point of view is that of the eukaryote, the organism, the individual. It is the point of view of the human being who speaks the point of view of his nervous system. We have been consistently coming to this point since the first eukaryotes staked their claim to complexity and development within a single life. The second point of view is that of the gene, the germoplasm. This is the view of eternity. I-life is the life of matter, and we-life is the life of information. I-life continues as long as the body exists and ends when the round ends. In the process of we-life, it is not the bodies that survive, but certain patterns of their existence. Genes never influence. Human attitudes, they are influenced by words, that is beliefs. Worldview, they are influenced by culture. Everything has a configuration, a star, sound, light, and thought. But in most cases, the configurations are fleeting, random, and meaningless. Everything acquires meaning only when matter in a certain configuration reproduces the same configuration in other matter, when there is continuity and a goal to be in the future. So life, once long ago, with its persistence and aspiration to move through time, defied the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy of the universe, that is infinite destruction. From the perspective of human, I-life, the stars appear to be immortal. But from the point of view of we-life, the life of ideas, of culture, it is man who has the potential for immortality. With the emergence of man, that is, the one who speaks, matter became infected with another independent type of information, convenient for copying. This information is the words we send to the audiovisual ports of the cities of other consciousnesses. By infecting a child's brain with language, we give it access to a library, but more importantly, to other consciousnesses, to other people. Just as the gene mind, having ridden matter, gained access to the future. Words are an alternative form of life that has grown in the vessels of the human brain. As long as words are understood by anyone, there is hope for mankind. Man is different from other living things in that he can speak and think in words. Because of this, his ability to understand reality and himself is unprecedented. Language is material of understanding. Without the pleasant and so familiar identifying marks, without letters, we would not recognize that there is something around to think about. After all, once seen, that is, captured by the eye, and then by the pen, cannot be returned to chaos ever. In this eternal implosion of reality, the meaning of the position of representatives of such a bizarre phenomenon as life, language does not just explain our world, it creates it for us. Now, it is very easy for us to answer the question, what is I? Is simply an idea of everything we associate with ourselves, a fractal created from the sound and spelling of our name, from experience, from the attention of parents, from the gifts, praise and judgment of friends, from preferences and likes, from pain and pleasure, discovery, hate and love, from disappointment and pride, from serenity and a face once seen in the mirror long ago. Thank you for your time. Bye.